Hey guys, and welcome back. In this video I wanted to do an opinion piece about indie hate and about entitlement, specifically with Vita gamers. And to do that, what we're going to do first is go back. We have to go back in time to 2011 and look at the history of where that came from and how that was birthed in the Vita community, and then what that sort of metastasized into. And I'd like to address certain holes in logic of people who have this indie hate, people who are part of the hate brigade for indie games, as well as sort of talk about why it's wrong to do that, and where gaming is going as a whole. So first let's go back in time. Let's look at the history here. Let's go back to 2011. So the Vita in 2011, right before the Vita launch, was positioned as a premium device that plays console-like games like FIFA, like Uncharted, Gravity Rush, Hot Shots Golf, Unit 13 Resistance, etc. They all came out early in the Vita's life and positioned it as the handheld to go to if you wanted the home console experience on the road. And there are people who say ooh, Sony didn't do that. It's all in your mind that, you wanted it to be like, no. Sony definitely positioned the Vita as this kind of device. They were even sued because they positioned the Vita as something you could just take your PS3 games with you on the go, which ended up not being true at all. So Sony did position the Vita like this in all their interviews and all their ads and all their commercials and everything. It was never positioned as an indie game machine. So if you're upset, if you bought the Vita for this reason alone, and you're upset because it only has low budget games, I'm on your side. I'm not against you here. That's very upsetting, but we're gonna move on from there. After a relatively decent launch in terms of hardware and software sold, Uncharted, Gravity Rush, Hot Shots Golf, and some other games broke six figures, and Vita actually sold pretty well the first couple months. A couple of things happened after that, though. Vita got a string of disappointing games in Resistance Burning Skies, Call of Duty Black Ops Declassified, and Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation. And those last two games were bundled with the platform, and of course Call of Duty was a bad game. It was a very, very bad game. If you liked Call of Duty, all more power to you on the Vita, but that's a bad game. I'm sorry, it was awful. And Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation was okay, but it was a little disappointing. Those were a lot of people's first games on the Vita because they were bundled with the system, and so they had a negative interpretation of the Vita because of those games. They thought all those games were going to be buggy or bad or crappy or not fun. Which created a big problem. But the other problem, which sort of came months after that, maybe related to it, I'm not sure, but Vita gamers stopped buying Vita AAA games as a whole. So Uncharted, Call of Duty, and maybe Persona aside, no other Vita game has broke 1 million units sold worldwide. None. In fact, some of the most expensive Vita games didn't even come close. Killzone Mercenary, let's take a look at that game. Highest production values in the system, sold 41,000 units in this first month. Little Big Planet, highest rated Vita exclusive of all time, sold around Killzone's level as well, maybe 50,000, 60,000 in the first month. Tearaway, and I know I've talked about Tearaway, I don't feel like ranting about Tearaway again, but that game was the highest rated Vita exclusive of that year. Almost universal praise, selling 14,000 units out of a system that at that time had maybe 2 or 3 million units sold in the United States. That's insane. That's insane. 14,000. There's more people living on my street than bought that game. That's absurd. So, what do you think this does? Think for a second. Don't for people who really hate indie games, think for 1 second here. If Sony is spending lots of money developing Vita games and pouring money into these Vita games, and they come out, and let's say in the first case they do really poorly in reviews, like Resistance Burning Skies or Call of Duty or Assassin's Creed, that sends a message to Sony. They're saying after those games, Sony said, oh shit, okay, we need to actually make good games. I see, we made bad games, are bad, let's make some good games. Let's make Killzone, let's pour some money into Killzone, Tearaway, Little Big Planet, those games. They poured money into those games, and then they didn't sell at all. So what message does that send to Sony? That sends a message that, okay, we can make bad games, they don't sell. We can make good games on Vita, they don't sell. Let's just not make games on Vita at all, because they just lost a ton of money. So after Tearaway's commercial failure, Sony sort of reevaluated its strategy, and they started trying to go after indie. They stopped developing for the Vita entirely, almost, and they started going after indie games on the Vita. So, because of course indie games are cheap, they're far less risk, and independent developers were really much more keen on the Vita than other third-party publishers were. Because of course other big AAA third-party publishers weren't developing at all for the Vita. And in many ways, this paid off for Sony, as you know, and independent publishers in big ways. Several independent publishers reported that they were profiting on the Vita, and in some cases, the Vita versions of their games, like Retro City Rampage, were the most profitable versions or the best-selling versions. I remember the developer of Retro City Rampage said that the Vita version of that game outsold the PS3 version and the PS4 version, or something like that, or the Steam version. I'm not sure, but it did very well. So indie games were coming out left and right for the Vita, and we finally had an end to the games drought. However, I guess because Sony bowed out of Vita game development entirely, which sucks, don't get me wrong, that sucks, and because third-party AAA developers gave up on the system ages before that, there was a clear lack of AAA games on the system. And this is where the misplaced indie hate started to come from. You see, people with any sort of critical thinking ability would know that the lack of new AAA games on the Vita and the rise of indie games on the Vita are mutually exclusive. They have virtually nothing to do with each other. Independent game studios aren't choosing to make smaller indie games over big budget games. AAA games were off the table for them. So it's not like, you know, it's not like Jonathan Mack, the creator of Soundshapes. It's not like he sat down and said, should I make Uncharted? Should I make Killzone? Oh, you know what, I'm going to make Soundshapes. No, he didn't. That conversation never happened in his head. He never had the budget to make those big games, or the staff, or the time. You know, like, it doesn't work like that. Independent studios make independent, smaller games because they don't have a choice. Those are the games they make. So an indie game coming out isn't coming at the cost of a AAA game, which is very, very important, and sort of breaks the logic of a lot of the complaints I'm seeing here. So there's basically three main points that I'm trying to say with this video that I'm going to try to sum up here, now that we've gone through the history and everything. Number one, hating indie games because of its budget or graphics is sad and stupid. Think about it. Gameplay is king, right? You know, like, games are supposed to be fun because they're fun. And the argument I hear a lot of times is oh, well, they're called video games for a reason. The video part, what they look like, is important. So if a game looks bad, it's a bad game. Or if a game's in 2D, it's a bad game. While I agree that, you know, like, graphics are important, 2D games can be beautiful and can be really cool looking. Like, I personally think that Dragon's Crown is one of the best looking games in the system despite being 2D. I also think Hotline Miami has a very striking visual style and is really amazing to look at, even though it's not just 2D, it's like a retro 2D. It looks really, really cool. It's striking. It's an art style choice. So that aside, even if they look like absolute crap, you know, graphics are nothing compared to gameplay. If the game is fun, who cares what it looks like, right? Who cares how much money is poured into the game? You know, does that make you enjoy a game more if more money is poured into it? That doesn't make any sense at all. So that logic alone, saying you hate indie games because of what they look like, is broken. Like, it's broken logic. That doesn't make any sense. You're not a gamer at that point. You know, like, what? It's the equivalent of saying, like, listening to music and it's not a top 40 song. It's not by Taylor Swift, so you hate it. You know, it's not by Lil Wayne, so you hate it. It's not by Katy Perry, so you hate it. It's by somebody you never heard of, so fuck it. You know, that's exactly what you're doing with games. That's how ridiculous you look. So, number two, being upset at the lack of AAA games on the Vita is completely justified. Completely. I'm not going to at all harp on these people at all, because I'm upset by the lack of AAA games on the Vita. I wish there was more. I wish we got a Call of Duty every year. I wish we got an Assassin's Creed every year. I wish we had 3 Uncharteds by now, you know? Another Killzone. You know, like, I wish we had more Tearaways, more Little Big Planets. I wish we had more AAA games as a whole. Even some other series from third parties, like I wish we had Final Fantasy or Onimusha, or, like, imagine the potential, you know? It would have been so cool to have this, but we don't. For whatever reason. you know? Even if it's, you know, gamers' fault that they're not buying games, or Sony's fault because they didn't give gamers enough reason to buy games or whatever. However you slice it, it's disappointing that we don't have AAA games, and I wish we did. And that's justified being angry at that. However, displacing your anger onto the games that the Vita is getting is not only irrational, not only stupid, but is detrimental to the Vita community, and to the gaming culture as a whole. So, as I said, AAA games, like indie games, aren't coming out at the cost of AAA games. Indie games are just coming out. Whether the Vita had a flood of AAA games, whether we had all the AAA games we wanted in the world, or whether we have none like we do now, indie games would still be coming out. We still have the same amount of indie games coming out, maybe even more. You know? So it's not like a studio sitting there saying, it's not like Sony sitting there saying, we should get BioShock on the Vita, or like we should get Last of Us on Vita. They are not having those conversations at all. They're not sitting there wondering what AAA games you should put on the system. They're not getting AAA games on the system at all, because no one's buying them. You cannot make a profit on the Vita with AAA games. You can't. You know, it's not possible. Not enough Vita gamers are buying the games, even if they're good. You know, and there's not enough Vita gamers as a whole to support that model. So the only model that works with the Vita, given how poorly the Vita has sold as a whole, is acquiring a pool of independent publishers to make games for the PS4 and for the Vita. And that's the only reason the Vita is still kicking now, is because of those independent publishers. So that's my second point. And my last point here is, you know, hating on indie games. Basically, hating on, for whatever reason, even if you say like, oh, I don't hate indie games, I just wish they were, you know, whatever. If you don't sort of change that attitude, like you're basically hating indie games is hating on where the future of gaming is going. And I say this like really, like, you know, as someone with a little bit of insight in the industry and looking at trends or whatever. The middle tier publisher is dead. You know, or is like on its deathbed on life support with a plug about to be pulled. They don't exist anymore. THQ died last generation. You know, so if you look at the PS3 360 gen, or the PS2 gen, you had these big, huge games like by Square Enix or Capcom, or by Sony, or by Microsoft, or like, you know, by Nintendo, these big, huge games. And then you also had these like smaller scale games, you know, like you know, like for every PS2, I'm having trouble thinking back now. Like for every like huge, big blockbuster game, you had like another game, like maybe like just a double A game, or like a B game, maybe. So the budget was cool. It was all in 3D. The budget was fairly big or whatever, but it just wasn't it wasn't like a Grand Theft Auto. It wasn't like a Final Fantasy. But you still had those ones. Those types of games, which was the majority of the PS2 and Xbox's, you know, library. They died in the PS3 generation because you can't make money off of them. You get buried under Call of Duty, you get buried under Assassin's Creed, and you don't sell units. So they died. And what rose up to take their place were indie games. You know? Small budget games costing, you know, a few $1,000s or whatever, which you can put out and make either break even, make a profit, or, you know, make an enormous, insane profit like Minecraft. Minecraft blew up and made an insane profit, billions of dollars. You know, so the military publisher is dead. You either have the big, huge AAA games, or you have indies. That's the way it's going to go. And the big AAA games are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Like, there's less and less of them announced. Indie games are the future. So I'm not saying, like, you know, there are people who have spent their time talking to me and sort of like really articulated why they don't like quote unquote indie games. And although I like to still poke holes in that logic, and I will continue to do so, I understand them. But that is a very unfortunate position, because whether you like it or whether you don't, this is where the industry is going. Indie games are the future, not only of the Vita, they definitely are the future of the Vita. But beyond that, 70-80% of the games being announced for PS4, Xbox One, maybe Nintendo's next console, will be indie games, not AAA games. So the reason why I made this video is because, you know, going on YouTube and going through the official PlayStation channel and seeing a new Vita game announcement or seeing a new Vita game video that they show is rare, because they're this is not often they support the Vita there, but whenever they do, it's usually an indie game, and a lot of the time it's a cool looking indie game. And when you click on the video, look at the dislike bar. It doesn't matter if the game is a new game, old game, great game, bad game. As long as it's an indie game, the dislike bar is going to be filled, and the comment section is going to be filled with people who are just saying like, why are the indie games like why don't you make AAA games to the Vita? Like, no one wants to play this garbage, or whatever. And not only is that like just that sort of, there's so many problems with this. Like, so not only is that a reaction detrimental to the Vita, it's and the culture like makes this sort of toxic atmosphere. But it's, first of all, Sony didn't make that game. It's an indie game, independent, meaning Sony's not funding it, they're not making it, it's coming from someone else. So filling that dislike bar means that the next time they want to support the Vita, they're not going to. So maybe that studio would form like a higher budget game next time, maybe something that you like. But seeing the way the Vita community is acting, they're not going to support the Vita anymore, And again, it's not coming from Sony. Like blaming Sony for allowing people to develop games on their system is stupid. Of course Sony's gonna let them develop games on their system, especially if it looks cool, especially if it's gonna make them money. Sony shouldn't be turning down games. So the main thing I want to say here is that if you hate indie games, you are an irrational person. Indie games aren't all the same. They're not all platforms. You hate platformers. A lot of people say, oh, I hate indie games because they're all platformers. No, they're not all platformers. I played indie RPGs. I played indie strategy games. I played indie puzzle games. I played indie shooters. I played a bunch of different types of indie games. There are so many of them, and it's your perception of indie games that's getting in your way of you actually enjoying them. But regardless of that, if you hate indie games and you'll never like them, and that's just how you are, smashing the dislike button of a video that Sony is putting out, who are you hurting? Like, you're getting, why are you, need to sort of analyze, why are you angry, and who are you hurting by hitting that dislike button on those videos? Who are you hurting by sending a nasty comment about it? The only person you're not hurting Sony. Sony doesn't care about the Vita. Sorry to break it to you, Sony doesn't care about the Vita. You're not hurting Sony. You're hurting the person who wants to bring that game to the Vita, the person who has absolutely nothing to do with the state of the Vita at all, a person who maybe in the future would make a game that you really like for the Vita. That's what you're doing. So maybe sort of people who sort of hate indie games, first and foremost, I'd say give them a chance. If there's so many Vita games, indie Vita games on the Vita right now, and I've played hundreds of them. Right now on my Vita I have like I think 120 games or something like that, most of them being indies. If you don't like indie games, how about you leave a comment here and tell me what genres, say you don't like indie games, but tell me what genres you like, and then I'll recommend you something, if I can, that I think you're going to enjoy. Try to come out with an open mind. I think that's the best sort of way to approach a situation. And that's been my mantra right now too. Like, I'm trying to be less stubborn. I'm trying to be more open-minded, and it actually pays off in big ways, believe it or not. And a quick little story before I end the video. I actually, a good friend of mine is a real big fan of visual novels, and I notoriously hate visual novels. I got a little bit into Danganronpa. I thought that was pretty cool, but I tried Virtue's Last Reward and I hated it. So he mailed me a copy of 999 on DS. And if I were as close-minded as the people who just hate indie games, saying, oh no, I hate all visual novels, I would never have played it. But I said, you know what? I'm going to not only play it, but I'm going to give it a chance. And I'm enjoying the hell out of it. I'm playing it now between my sessions of Metal Gear or whatever, and I'm really, really enjoying it. I think it's great, and I'm really, really... I would have never been able to experience that if I wasn't open-minded. So I challenge people who just hate games based off of the publisher, based off the fact that they're from a smaller studio, that I challenge you to sort of like, try indie games, try more indie games, try to like, don't think they're all platformers, like, you know, like really go out there and explore and read reviews and try to find something you'll enjoy, because indie games are games. They're just games with a lower budget, you know, and you can find a plethora of variety there and things that you'll enjoy, definitely. And the reason I'm saying this is because, of course, you can't change a community without people changing. And I don't just want to sit there and point the finger at you guys. I want you guys to enjoy gaming as a whole, especially considering that this is where the future of gaming is going. Anyway, thanks for listening, guys, and of course, pick up Super Time Force. It's wicked awesome. It's a lot of fun, and try to be more positive. Try to inject more positivity into the Vita community, especially considering that 90% of the games we're getting are indie games now, and if you own a Vita, those are the games you have to look forward to. So you have a choice between being perpetually upset all the time, or, you know, broadening your horizons and trying to enjoy some genres that maybe you didn't think you'd enjoy. Anyways, thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.